Something quiet is shifting. It doesn't knock, it doesn't flare up. It hums underneath the surface, rearranging thoughts and stirring up instincts like wind catching loose papers. People might mistake this week for ordinary, but the atmosphere carries a strange kind of friction, like static waiting to snap. Beginning around June 4th, perception itself begins to bend in subtle but meaningful ways. It's not just a moon phase dwindling toward darkness, it's a thinning veil, one that lets hidden patterns slip into plain sight without anyone noticing they've arrived. Celestial timing isn't random. As the moon arcs into its final quarter, two other players step onto the stage, Saturn and Venus. Their proximity to the moon in the coming days creates a kind of triangle that presses down on the psyche, not with drama, but with an odd, unshakable pressure. This combination doesn't shout, it whispers, it nudges, it subtly alters the lens through which decisions are made. And by the time the consequences surface, most will have forgotten there was even a choice made at all. Sometimes the quietest moments are the ones that alter everything. Not because of what happens, but because of what subtly rearranges. It's worth asking, what has been showing up repeatedly in thoughts, in dreams, in the background noise of the day? What has been quietly pulling focus without permission? Setting an intention this week isn't about making a list. It's more like anchoring a direction, a single thread in the fabric before it weaves into something bigger. And for those who track energy, maybe jotting down that thread will help connect the dots later. Perhaps even use 444 as a symbolic marker, just to see if the universe answers back. If something inside you felt still while watching this, it means you're aligning. Subscribe and stay close, because the transmission continues. Give it a week. Look back and trace the steps. Often the signs are only clear in reverse. And if mental clarity has been feeling a bit fractured, the kind of fog that makes people lose track of time or forget what they were about to say, that's not just tiredness. That's signal interference. And there's a very real cause behind it. One that hasn't been talked about yet. But stay close, because in just a moment, it's going to make perfect sense. Something deeper is unfolding. Something harder to spot unless the silence is really listened to. What comes next isn't just movement, it's depletion. Not exhaustion from effort, but a kind of silent siphoning. As the calendar edges toward June 4th, the moon dips into its final quarter, not with fireworks, but with a quiet, merciless retreat. Despite its neutral title, this part of the cycle often feels like a spiritual recession, a drop below the threshold where the conscious mind likes to roam. In this window, the internal flame dims, not out of weakness, but from something being quietly dismantled behind the scenes. Apathy creeps in like static. Motivation gets lost in the folds of the day, and reality itself starts to feel slippery. But underneath the fog, something far more intentional is underway. There are those who once referred to this particular phase as a time when unseen forces, subtle but real, latch on and pull threads from the psyche, like energetic barnacles feeding on emotion, confusion, or fatigue. This part of the cycle isn't about damage, it's about extraction. As identity becomes porous and familiar patterns start to unravel, there's an invitation hiding beneath the discomfort. What if this moment of not knowing, this odd forgetfulness of self, is actually the body's way of clearing out a version of being that was never truly anchored? Sometimes clarity doesn't arrive as light. Sometimes it arrives as absence. And if that sounds strange, think about this. When was the last time stillness was allowed to speak louder than certainty? There's a point in the lunar cycle that rarely gets mentioned. It's not lit up with revelation or charged with ritual. It just dissolves. A strange pocket of time between the letting go and the new beginning. The sky turns blank, and that blankness isn't empty. It's a portal. Not the kind that opens upward, but the kind that folds inward. This is when the subconscious gets louder than the surface self. When fragments once thought buried start to surface in the quiet. Asking to be noticed, not to haunt, but to be understood. If you understood even part of this, it means the signal is reaching you. Subscribe. The rest will make sense soon enough. This part of the cycle often works like a key unlocking hidden rooms. Things long exiled from memory drift up, sensations that feel like memories, faces that show up in sleep with no clear origin, emotions with no visible trigger, and every so often, a strange synchronicity, numbers repeating like drum beats or awakenings in the middle of the night at oddly precise moments. Some call it coincidence, but ask honestly, has it ever really free? In these hours, truth rarely comes dressed in clarity. More often, it arrives in confusion, dreams, flashbacks, even discomfort. But here's a thought. What if that discomfort is just the feeling of a former version of self falling away? Not every visitor from the past arrives to stay. Some come back so they can be properly released. The dark phase of the moon doesn't provide vision. It asks for trust. It invites the senses to navigate without sight, to reach into a silence so deep, something true begins to take shape again. Not by force, but by recognition. Some alignments don't arrive with celebration. They arrive with silence, and in that silence, a confrontation. Around June 4th, the moon meets a force that doesn't flatter. It doesn't punish either. It holds still and asks for honesty. The stories people tell themselves about their limits, about time, about readiness, they start to unravel under this kind of sky. Not because of external pressure, but because the usual narratives suddenly don't hold. The mind loops, reaches for the familiar excuse, and finds it echoing hollow. When emotional fluidity meets structural gravity, there's a sharpening. What once passed as logic starts to show its real shape, often built more from fear than from fact. There's a tendency to say that the atmosphere is heavy during times like this. But what if that heaviness is just a backlog of choices never made? Structures that were mistaken for safety, but were really just habits dressed up in spiritual language. Ever notice how often the phrase, "not the right time," becomes a way to stay still? If you felt something here, like it was meant just for you, maybe it was. Subscribe. No need to explain it. Just stay. This week doesn't arrive to shame, but to clarify. The tension is not conflict, it's compression. And compression always reveals form. If decisions have been delayed, postponed, or shoved into corners of the mind marked later, this is the moment the pressure starts to rise. Not to crush, but to refine. The shape of an old avoidance will become visible, and what felt murky will now press to the surface, demanding a new kind of honesty. Isn't it strange how people fear their potential more than their collapse? Growth asks something inconvenient, a surrender of the identity that once protected. And right there lies the pivot. Real change never asks for perfection, it asks for participation. This convergence between emotion and boundary isn't here to take clarity away. It's here to remove what was never clarity in the first place. And if that stings, good. It means something real just got touched. Something strange has been happening lately, and most are too distracted to question it. The mind slips, conversations trail off, the hours lose their edges. It's easy to assume this is fatigue or digital burnout. But what if the scatter isn't a flaw in attention, but a shift in design? In the liminal days between the last quarter and the new moon, something subtle starts stirring. The lunar frequency doesn't just retreat, it rewrites. And the rewrite doesn't happen with thunder. It happens through interference. Memory starts getting selective. Emotions from years ago bubble up, then disappear without closure. Half-formed thoughts unravel before they're spoken. But this isn't chaos, it's refinement. Like an old software patch quietly uninstalling the programs that no longer run. All the lingering dialogues with ghosts, the unresolved loops of what if and should have, they're being pulled up, not to punish, but to release. This kind of forgetting isn't careless, it's sacred maintenance. Still thinking about what you just heard? That's not an accident. Subscribe. Let what's waking up in you keep unfolding. Here's a thought worth pausing on. What if disorientation is just transition wearing its cloak? When the mind begins to detach from identities and stories that have grown too tight, confusion is often the first visitor. But confusion can be a bridge, not a block. Those moments where names slip, where habits lose appeal, where plans feel irrelevant, those are signals. Not of failure, but of files being closed. And isn't that exactly what makes room for something new to download? This fog that's been drifting through lately isn't here to be conquered. It's here to be witnessed. Pay attention to what stops feeling important, what memories go quiet, what distractions suddenly fade. That's the soul handing off baggage. Not everything needs to be remembered in order to be honored. And maybe that's the gift. Not clarity, but weightlessness. Not understanding, but a hunger to begin again without the layers. So now the question becomes, what is finally being dropped without anyone realizing it? Around June 3rd, a tender voltage starts to pulse through the atmosphere. The moon begins drifting closer to Venus, and suddenly a soft ache stirs, one that doesn't shout but simmers. At first it feels like nostalgia, a flicker of a face, a question that slips into the mind uninvited, a strange pull to reconnect with something, or someone, that once offered validation. This isn't just affection rising, it's a flare in the emotional field, designed to locate where the inner scaffolding has been left incomplete. You're not here by mistake. If this felt like home, it probably is. Subscribe and stay where the deeper truths live. At this point, the energy doesn't ask for love. It reveals the craving for it. And that craving is a spotlight, not on anyone else, but on the part of the psyche still hoping someone external will affirm worth, beauty, significance. This isn't about romance, it's about recognition. That impulse to post something just for attention, to scroll through memories that no longer serve, to test old wounds under the illusion of curiosity, it's a signal. Not of weakness, but of exposure. The old hunger is surfacing again. This isn't manipulation from the sky, it's reflection. The lunar field entangles with Venus in a way that makes even shallow attention feel like a lifeline. And during this alignment, the longing often gets mistaken for fate. But ask this, what's actually being sought? Is it connection, or is it relief from the echo chamber of one's own uncertainty? This week tests that difference. It tempts with illusion, then waits to see if discernment has been cultivated beneath the desire. The truth? Most of the emotional chasing that happens under this kind of alignment isn't about anyone else at all. It's about the self, searching for permission to feel worthy again. The temptation might show up sweetly, reunion, vulnerability, charm. But if the foundation isn't stable, the aftermath can feel sharp, because desire without grounding becomes distortion. And distortion always costs more on the way down. This is not a trap, it's a measure. A subtle way of asking whether validation is still being outsourced or whether it's finally been claimed from within. And once that answer becomes clear, not intellectually, but viscerally, everything that follows becomes easier to navigate. So the real question is this: when the craving hits, will it be a loop or will it be a lesson? Something about June 3rd feels dimensionless, not empty, but suspended. Like time itself is waiting for a cue that hasn't arrived yet. It's the kind of day that doesn't start, not really. Hours stretch but don't anchor. The mind floats just a few inches above the body, watching the day play out like a scene rehearsed too many times. That subtle disconnection sparks a question in the background. What's off? What's been forgotten? But here's the thing, nothing has been missed. This is the pause before the pivot. The moon is nearing its deepest descent, and something unseen is pulling back before the reset begins. There is an old phrase, rarely spoken now, that refers to this particular moment as the breath between waves. Not collapse, not rebirth, just the space between them. In that space, clarity dissolves by design. Orientation disappears so that something new can arrive later without being shaped by the old framework. This is not confusion as error. It's confusion as permission. A rare invitation to stop making sense. A day designed not for production or direction, but for allowing something slower, something quieter to move through. In most environments, confusion is treated like an enemy, something to fix, define, or push through. But what if the not knowing is a kind of intelligence? What if awareness only sharpens once noise dies down enough for other frequencies to speak? Right now, the atmosphere is filled with signals, but not the kind that respond to force. The modern mind wants conclusions, but this is not that kind of season. It's the drift. and forcing clarity now would only carve the wrong map. This is where mystery holds the most weight, not as an obstacle, but as a tool for refinement. Disconnection isn't failure, it's recalibration, a necessary separation from ideas, goals, or versions of self that have outlived their usefulness. The absence isn't hollow, it's just filled with truths not yet translated. So if the moment feels untethered, don't anchor it. Let it float. Let the wall staring, time looping, memory sinking be what it is. That's how subtle shifts move. That's how something that no longer belongs starts to fall away. Quietly, invisibly, but completely. Sometimes the smallest disruptions speak the loudest. A glass slips, a light flickers out, a thread snaps clean without tension. Most would write it off. An accident, nothing more. But around the days bridging June 3rd through 4th, such interruptions begin to pattern themselves. The timing isn't random. The environment shifts subtly, and objects that once held still begin to respond. The moon doesn't announce its presence. It alters the room by changing its silence, and in doing so, it shakes loose what no longer fits. This part of the lunar cycle doesn't clear with ceremony. It clears like a whisper pressed against the walls of the physical world, making the symbolic literal. A favorite shirt tears. A photograph frame collapses without warning. A familiar trinket vanishes, seemingly on its own. But here's where it gets interesting. Each of those items holds memory, pattern, or identity. And when internal frequencies change, the external things tied to them either resonate or rupture. And rupture in this context is a release. Objects act as witnesses. They absorb the moments they're present for, the habits, the moods, the repetitive thoughts running through the space. When evolution happens internally, those objects, if misaligned, crack. Not because they're defective, but because the version of reality they belong to has begun to dissolve. A piece of jewelry connected to longing, a notebook soaked in anxiety, a chair once used to escape. All become misfits in a timeline that is rewriting itself quietly but decisively. It would be easy to panic, to glue it back together, to replace what was lost as if nothing happened. But that would miss the point entirely. The break is a message, not in code, but in sensation. The emotional blueprint attached to that item has completed its task. And now the structure housing it, whether wood, metal, wire, or cloth, can no longer contain what has already been set free. These aren't malfunctions, they are extractions. And they arrive not to destroy, but to remind. So when something breaks, consider not what it cost, but what it cleared. Ask what part of the self had been embedded inside it. And while pausing there, just for a moment, what if the break wasn't random at all? What if the object itself volunteered for the release, so something more aligned could step forward in its place? As the calendar drifts toward its darker edge, a pressure builds, but not the kind that pushes from the outside. This is an inward force, quiet and persistent, like the sensation of wearing a coat that suddenly feels too tight. The waning crescent moves silently overhead, yet its presence begins to tug at the psyche in peculiar ways. A flicker of restlessness here, a flash of dissonance there. It's rarely dramatic. More often, it shows up as a subtle discomfort, a gentle but constant reminder that something within has outlived its place. This is not a season of extremes. It doesn't demand a total reset or ask for dramatic acts of letting go. The lunar field at this point is too refined for that. Instead, it calls for precision. One choice, one object, one thread that's ready to be released. That's all. Just one. Something that has been clinging to the corners of consciousness for too long. Perhaps it's a phrase that always triggers defense, a habit so ingrained it's invisible, a thought loop that no longer holds relevance but keeps playing anyway. These aren't massive dramas, they're quiet leaks in the system. The task is not to force resolution, but to recognize the point of friction. Even without a plan or a full explanation, something can be acknowledged as finished. This phase isn't about momentum, it's about space. And space, as simple as it sounds, is what allows new alignments to form. This isn't minimalism, it's energetic economy. Knowing what no longer belongs and releasing it without ceremony. The magic isn't in doing more, it's in holding less. And that single subtraction, if aligned, becomes a signal that rewrites what's possible. It might not feel like a breakthrough, it might just feel like breathing easier. But that ease ripples, it rearranges circumstances, shifts timelines, and creates the exact kind of vacancy that life needs to introduce something unfamiliar and entirely right. Not because it's been chased, but because space was made. So now the question becomes, what's ready to be put down? Not because it's heavy, but because it's no longer necessary. Pause there. Let the body answer before the mind catches up. It doesn't require an announcement or a ritual. It only asks for a moment of honesty and a willingness to loosen the grip. Because sometimes the most powerful transformation begins with just one, almost invisible, release. There's something building, but not in the way most would expect. The final stretch before the new moon carries an energy so subtle, so internal, it rarely registers on the surface. These last few days of the month might appear motionless, uneventful, even flat. But underneath that perceived stillness, a quiet reconfiguration is underway. The lunar body is stepping into shadow, and with that descent comes the opening of an invisible threshold. There won't be a flash, no dramatic sign, just a rising sense, a hum in the bones before the mind even has words for it. This isn't just the tail end of a cycle, it's the space between endings and invitations. And the reason most people miss it isn't because it's hidden. It's because presence requires stillness, and stillness is rare for those able to lower the volume of their surrounding.